I'm Louis Foster, the coordinator of the Multiple Family Group Therapy Resource Center. On March the 14th, 1994, I had the opportunity to talk with Dr. George H. Orvin, a psychiatrist specializing in the treatment of adolescents. Dr. Orvin is recognized as the father of adolescent multiple family group therapy, and he talks on this videotape about his model of therapy with adolescents, as well as his working with families in multiple family group therapy. George has been doing multiple family group therapy for approximately 30 years, and the videographer and I enjoyed his interview so much that we chose not to edit it in any way, but to allow you to see the unedited version of this interview. Both of us think that you will enjoy it, and I think you'll have fun.
When I do that about the Pope, the man who spent his life tailoring clothes, and when he retired, his tailor's friends made arrangements for him to have an audience with the Pope in Rome. And they flew him over, paid all his expenses, and he had a private audience with the Pope. And this fellow had spent his life doing nothing but making clothes for man. And he was thrilled to be able to meet the Pope. And they came back, all his friends were eager to find out what it was like. And they said to him, "Tell us, Mike, what sort of a man is the Pope?" And he said, "He's a 37 regular." Tailors do that. They see people according to their view of the world. Psychiatrists do that. Right. People in the mental health field do that. We bring a certain bias to our work, and that influences how we think and how we manage to deliver care. So I think it's helpful for people to have some idea about that.
I agree with you. So would you be willing to share how it is that Dr. George Orvin got to where he is today? Maybe a little bit of a resume?
Sure. It's sort of part of the truth in packaging. Yeah, I would sort of alert you to the fact that first of all, I'm a physician. And because of that, I view so much through the eyes of a physician. And I can't help that. I've been trained in medicine. Right. And that's what I'm supposed to do, look at problems as a physician. Secondly, I'm a physician who treats mental and emotional disorders. That is, I'm a psychiatrist. And because of that, that causes me to look at problems as psychiatrists do. On top of that, I'm not just a psychiatrist, but I am an adolescent psychiatrist. Now let's clarify, I mean I'm a psychiatrist who treats the adolescent rather than a psychiatrist who still is an adolescent. I don't mean I'm an adolescent, I mean I'm a psychiatrist who specializes in the treatment of the adolescent. Right. Now all of those things conspire to influence what I think and how I manage the conduct of my career. On top of that, I'm a husband, I'm a father, and I'm a grandfather. All of those things have had their influence in shaping the way I view the world. So, having spent 10 years in general practice, it's hard for me to forget all those things that I learned in the bosom of of a family that was having some sort of medical problem. I found that I was spending a lot of time with families. When I would treat a family in general practice, before I went into psychiatry, I found that periodically I would sort of run behind schedule. And lo and behold, it was always because the patient had some sort of emotional problem, something other than his cut finger. And I would get so engrossed in what was happening in that person's life that I would lose track of my time and run behind schedule. I finally decided the best thing for me to do was to get trained properly. That I was practicing psychiatry without portfolio. That needed the training, so I went back. Closed my practice here in Charleston and went back to the university and spent 3 years studying psychiatry there, and then took another year at the University of London at the Maudsley Hospital and spent a little over a year there, and then came back and joined the faculty at the Medical University. There I taught psychiatry. And I taught
University of Charleston.
in Charleston, here in Charleston, at the Medical University of South Carolina. And I taught adolescent psychiatry. I started in 1962 to practice on the faculty of the university in 1961, actually. In 1967, I limited my practice to the adolescent and was given the opportunity of setting up an all-adolescent inpatient psychiatric service at the Medical University. Now, at that time, there weren't any adolescent psychiatry beds anywhere in the Southeast, anywhere.
Wow.
That were designed just for adolescents, inpatient psychiatric care. There were 11 or 12 other facilities in the entire country that were university-based and dedicated to the treatment of the adolescent, psychiatric treatment of adolescent.
Right.
So we set up that program in the Department of Psychiatry at the Medical University and began an all-adolescent service, 10 beds. 10 beds, that's all. My job at that point was to treat dysfunctional or sick adolescents. But that wasn't the full extent of my job. My job was to treat sick children, but it was also to teach others how to treat sick children,
Right.
which added a dimension to what we were doing that made the job more fun, but enlarged the challenge in that at that time there wasn't much in the way of textbooks about the adolescent. Child psychiatry was fairly well established at that time, and child psychiatry took care of the adolescent when they had to, usually against their wishes. And when I recall flipping through some of the child psychiatry books when I began working with the adolescent, and you go back to the index and look up the word adolescent, and sure enough they'd have 2 references in the whole book. Juvenile delinquency usually was what it was about. So at that time there was really nothing to be, nothing that you could really prepare yourself adequately for. So I learned about adolescence groping in the dark. I and my staff began to learn some things about treating the adolescent. And the thing that I learned, I think, first of all and quickest, was that the most powerful recuperative force in the treatment of dysfunctional children is the bosom of that child's family. Now, the family is supposed to do 3 things. The human family is to produce and autonomize children, new recruits for the future. Society looks to the family for that. Right. And they look to parents to indoctrinate these replacements and get them ready so that when they're needed, when other parts of society die off, they've got new recruits coming on. So the human family is supposed to create children and autonomize them, raise them up. That's number one. Number two, the human family is supposed to provide for the care, the physical safety, and the physical needs of its members. And thirdly, the human family is supposed to stabilize and fulfill the development of the personalities of the parents. That family is the place where children grow, but family is also the place where adults are supposed to grow. And it's in that context that we find dysfunctional children. We find them in families that are struggling to keep their heads above water. And if we're going to understand the child and the problems that he's having, we must of necessity thoroughly understand the context in which that child is struggling. What's going on with this child is a very legitimate question. And what are the barriers that he's encountering? But also, what's going on in that family?
So you are thinking in systems already.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And that is a system. You think of the family as a system. It has its own boundary. It has its own location. It has its way of communication. It has its feedback loops. And it touches on other systems. The educational system, the occupational system, the governmental system, religious system, and other families, other systems. So I think in understanding what's happening with families, we need to have some understanding about what is it that families are supposed to do. And not just really the general responsibilities, but how do families change? What are the things that happen within families? And how do those events influence the growth and development of this particular child? But also, how do those events influence the growth of the people who are taking care of this particular child?
So you might be referencing the individual growth experience of each person in the family as well as the family life cycle.
Yeah, I think that's what I like to call a process of becoming that all of us experience. It begins at creation or at birth. And it's a process that goes on. It's psychologic, sociologic, biologic, theologic, educational, and we grow in that process. And we are in the process of becoming who we are going to become and what we are going to become. When you see someone like me, like here I am, I have become. I've reached a point in my life where I've probably done as much growing as I'm supposed to do. I've sort of warned my wife, what you see is what you get. It doesn't go get any better. Maybe no worse, but certainly no better. But that process is going on. Mm-hmm. And that you are in the process of turning out. Someday you're going to reach the end point of all of the psychologic, sociologic growing that you're now doing. Right. You're going to become who it is you eventually become. Knowing that that's going on has helped me to be abused at times as I view my own growth, but certainly contemplative and thoughtful about, well, now, wait a minute, what's happening? And what impact is this event going to have on me?
That where you use the word abused, I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
Amused.
Oh, amused. Okay.
Yeah, tickled and sometimes
okay.
entertained by what's happening to me. And to be able to sort of be objective about that. We struggle through life. We struggle through life. My good clergyman, Sam Cobb, my rector at St. Philip's Church, said to me, George, he said, in this existential experience which we call life, we seem eternally trapped between doing what we should and doing what we must. That it's a struggle, that we're sort of working our way through life. We're sort of problem-solving our way through life and learning our way through life. Right. And all those events have some influence on how that process is progressing. And you need to sort of have an understanding of what's happening with that adolescent. You need to know that there are parts of life where each of us faces specific sort of challenges, and pretty much commonly so as human beings, as fellow human beings. The adolescent at age 12 to 13 begins to develop into an adult. He wants to become an adult. That's part of it. The other part that's just as tough is not only becoming an adult, but stop being a child. Right. You've got to stop being a child. And you and I, working as helpers, sometimes stumble in our efforts to help the adolescent if we somehow or other don't recognize that he's trying to become an adult. He's offended. If somehow or other we treat him as if he's still a child, he's outraged. In fact, he'll do things to his own disadvantage to prove to you that you can't make me, so there. That is, he's struggling to become an adult, but struggling even harder to stop being a child. And what he has to do at age 12 to 13, he's got about 3 major hurdles. You have to start thinking about your parents differently. You have to stop seeing them as mythologic giants so that you can stop thinking of yourself as a helpless little child. Now, one of the ways that you stop thinking about your parents as giants is to cut them down to size. Cut the legs off. Right. And sure, they can't make you do anything you don't want to do. Adolescents run into problems doing that. 35 to 40-year-old people run into problems when it's happening to them through one of their children. Has this child beginning to demythologize his parent, and has the parent, what's happening to him? He too is struggling. What happens to people around age 40? Huh? You begin to add up the score. Right. You begin to recognize that there are probably fewer tomorrows than there are yesterdays. You begin to come to terms with your dreams and your hopes, your ambitions, your options narrow down. So that when that adolescent is struggling to disabuse himself of this view of his wondrous, wonderful, all-powerful parents, Those poor folks are struggling with their own problems, mom and dad. A 40-year-old mother is undergoing some changes.
Right.
Her role in life is changing. Her reproductivity is about to come to an end when all of a sudden, right under her nose, the reproductivity of her 14-year-old daughter blossoms. Most mothers celebrate that development in their child.
That's one of the few rites of passages
Yes.
that we have in this society.
That's right. But it says something to mother. And the contrast stings a little bit.
Right.
As she sees the beginning of creative capacity in this child, it reminds her that hers is on the wane. Now, see, those are things that are part of this process of becoming. Those are the sort of things that influence the psychologic status and equanimity of parents as the children are struggling to become adults. So they have to change their view of their parents. Two, they have to try to find out who they are. As young adolescents, we struggle to flesh out some sort of identity of what sort of person we are. Thirdly, we have to find out what it's like to be a man and to be a woman. That is, we have to sort of evolve a gender identity, a gender-ness. All of that creates ferment within the family system. Depending on how well those two adults are getting along, and depending on how well they comprehend what's happening, and depending on their own psychological intactness, they're going to respond to what this adolescent child is trying to do, and they are either going to help it or hinder it. So that when you and I see an adolescent who's struggling with some sort of difficulty, we scratch our heads and wonder, what is it that's happening to this child? And we'll always be ill-informed until we find out what else is happening at home.
Right.
Get hold of that family. So as I had these children that I was treating, I said to the parents, you must come and help me. You have to take part. Well, doctor, he's really the problem. We want to do whatever we can to help him. And my position has always been, you can't do that. You got to help me, help somebody you love. So that I would demand that the family come.
So if I'm on the telephone with you and my son is with you and I didn't come at the admission, would you pick up the phone and give me a call?
Well, I tell you what, I wouldn't evaluate him.
Okay, so parents would have to be there.
I wouldn't evaluate him. And if you're not that worried about him, neither am I.
Good point.
That sounds sort of calloused. But I think in some ways we become ambiguous about what we tell our families, because I think some of us understand that we really ought to have the family involved, but we aren't afraid they won't come. We're afraid they will. And then what am I going to do? My goodness, how am I going to manage these? I don't know. So we collude at an unconscious level to avoid the parents and avoid the family. And when the family says, well, I can't make it on Fridays, well, all right, we'll do the best we can without you then, which really gives us an excuse for failing.
Right.
And when we fail, it's going to be your fault because you didn't come. But we both collude in that. And I think up front, one needs to be able to say, well, tell you what, if you're not interested in coming, some people come too soon, some people come too late, but some come too soon. And you folks aren't ready for help yet. When you're ready, get in touch with me. Because I think it has to be some understanding that if you are going to allow illness to remain encapsulated within the family system, you're not going to produce health in any other part. And I've seen healthy individuals live in families that were maladaptive and dysfunctional, but it's virtually impossible to really take a young adolescent and treat him without some sort of participation by his family.
So for the Department of Social worker who sees a poor child who has a parent who may be not as educated as you and me, and they aren't as available as what we might find in a middle-class family, if this child were to come and get help and treatment, would that make any difference in this child's life if, for example, the parents wouldn't come?
Well, it might, you know. In some ways, we sometimes have to strike deals that we don't particularly like, and sometimes you end up doing the best you can. But I think in some ways we are accustomed to saying, well, those people don't care about their children. Those people don't care about their children. Now, I've dealt with all 5 socioeconomic classes, the richest and the poorest, the least educated and the PhDs and the MDs. I've dealt with the full spectrum. And I've found that a lot of times the folks who have a severely dysfunctional child are doing about the best they can. And what happens is that child gets into some sort of trouble, and the police get him and take him home and knock on the door and get mama and say, here, we caught him breaking windows, throwing rocks at cars. Make him stop, do something. Do what? This poor woman, 9 chances out of 10, is madly treading water with her nose just above the surface.
Working to survive.
The last thing she needs is one more wave. And somebody brings her the child and says, do something, and she says, do what? We don't know, but do something. Again and again, my experience was when I would say to that mother, you are and you will come, because I will help you. I will help you and I will help your child. There is hope. Something can be done and things will get better. Many of them breathe a sigh of relief. Finally, somebody is going to help me.
Right.
And I think we need to have some sort of understanding. I think all parents love their children. All parents love their children for a very simple reason. You can't help it. Mm-hmm. Now, not all parents are good parents. Sometimes loving them isn't enough. You've got to have some other skills too and be able to do some other things. But I think it must be taken as a given that this child's parents are not really trying to make his life miserable. They really aren't trying to make things worse. They may be doing that, right, but usually it's because they think the wrong thing is the right thing.
So it's not what they don't know, it's what they know that's not true.
Well, that's true. That's true. And you know, that it's easy to do the right thing. When the choice is between doing the right thing and doing the wrong thing, we all do the right thing. But what do you do when the choice is between the wrong thing and the wrong thing? Then what do? You do the best you can in life.
An example of that might be the struggle that parents are having today with adolescents who smoke cigarettes.
Oh, certainly. or doing some of the other things that they're doing. You know, you are limited as to what you can do if you've got all the skills. Life deals us a hand of cards. And those hands aren't always ace, kings, queens, and jacks. For a lot of folks, that hand has some 2s and 3s and a couple of jokers.
Right.
And that's the hand they've got, and that's the hand they've got to play. I've had people who just didn't have a high education. Right. And boy, they were doing the best they could. They were making some bad mistakes. These are people who had maybe ill health, a number of problems that they had. But almost all of them were trying.
You know, when an adolescent has a parent that he has to overcome that myth of parent with, I think that is a natural part of that growth that I think I'm hearing you say. Yes. What about the adolescent or child who doesn't have a parent or doesn't have a myth?
Well, you know, I think almost every child has somebody, has a something. And if you look, and if you'll be creative and innovative about that, I would always insist that the child's family come and take part. Sometimes there was no family. Right. But I almost always found a social worker that liked this child in particular, or an uncle, or an aunt, or a grandmother, or grandfather. And if I worked at it, I could get somebody who would come and be an advocate for this child. Right. If not a real mama or daddy, an advocate.
Do we move from one myth to the next myth?
Well, I think what we need very much is to sort of foster a better impression of who we are and what we are with ourselves. You see, when we start in life, we very much are at the mercy of fate and the elements. A newborn child laid on a shelf somewhere for 2 weeks. When you go back, that child's going to be dead. A child needs immediate care because it's so vulnerable. That child, as it begins to develop some sense of the world around him, needs to believe that he has some protection. Somebody cares enough to take care of me. If that infant and that little child really understood how dangerous this world was and how vulnerable he is or she is, no psychological growth could take place. The child would spend its time in constant terror. So, the human mind is a wonderful instrument. It projects onto these people called parents power and knowledge that no human being could possibly possess. My dad's the strongest man in the world. My dad could beat your dad. My mom's the most wonderful woman in the world. She won't let anything happen to me. Those are the things we need to believe so that we can go blissfully about the business of being a child.
So if we believe the system has power, then the system has power.
That's right. But when we reach adolescence, we're beginning to become an adult. And if we go into adulthood believing that mama and daddy are these mythologic giants, then we're going to continue to believe that we are helpless, vulnerable little weaklings. So we have to disabuse ourselves of the belief that mom and dad are all powerful so that we can get rid of the belief that we are totally helpless. So you see, it's shrugging off an encumbrance.
So it's shedding a system of denial.
Well, yes, and it's a matter of beginning to no longer need external security, beginning to provide our own security in preparation for ultimately becoming a provider of security for others. And the trip from consumer of security to provider of security is neither quick, smooth, nor direct. That is part of the process of becoming an adult, is shedding this belief that somehow or other I'm helpless.
So you're saying we move from dependency to interdependence?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. We must begin to surrender that dependence. And we finally surrender, I think, the last little bit of symbolic dependence when our last parent dies.
And we become an orphan.
I had a 45-year-old lady say to me, her mother just died, and she said, for the first time in my life, I'm no longer somebody's little girl. You become an adult. So that's part of what that adolescent is doing, is beginning to take unto himself a view of himself as competent and capable of taking care of himself. And he must, in order to do that, he must get rid of some childish beliefs. Now, when he begins to shed this encumbrance, it's helpful if those who have been providing him with his protection understand what's happening and permit it, and if possible, even help it. At least try to not absolutely thwart it.
So you're saying be careful what battles you choose to win with your adolescence.
Although you have to fight, yes.
Or
To fight. And let me go one step further. The parent is going to respond to that threat of the disruption of the family, because when that first child leaves, that's the first harbinger of the ultimate death of the family. Families get born, families have a childhood, families even have an adolescence, families mature, families grow up, families die.
Or parents get divorced and families die prematurely.
That's true. So that as that adolescent begins to struggle against the ties of the family, those parents need to understand what's happening. And they're going to respond to his efforts depending upon what's happening between the two of them. If there's one thing a parent can do to ensure some sort of psychological health for their child, it isn't so much what you tell them to do and not do. What matters most of all is how you and I, as a man and a woman, as a mother and a father, treat one another.
So the most important relationship in a family is the husband and wife relationship.
Exactly right. And we begin to deceive and to betray our children when first we believe that the parent-child relationship transcends the husband-wife. That's the foundation of the family. That's what is going to help this child get through. Because you see, for a man and a woman, they've come together and they've put two processes of becoming together. Each is influencing the other. And my wife has influenced how I've turned out. I've influenced how she has turned out. But each of us has been in the process of turning out and becoming whatever it is we're going to become. So that these two processes of becoming are happening. One of the things that influences those processes is the introduction of a child into that family system. Now, if the two parents can meet the needs of each other, children will prosper more. For when one parent fails to meet the needs of the other, that parent reaches across the generational boundary and involves himself or herself in a need-fulfilling relationship with one of the children. And if that relationship is the only thing mother has going, if she no longer feels valued as a woman and as a wife, if all she's got left is mother, she's going to be loath to give it up quickly or easily. And as that child begins to move away from home, that really means the end of a need-fulfilling relationship. And unwittingly and unknowingly, mother might very well thwart this child's move toward autonomy, not understanding why. That happens less frequently when that woman is valued as an individual, is valued as a woman, is valued as a wife, and valued as a mother. And sometimes being mother feels so good that women tend to discount the value of just being a human being, the value of being a special kind of human being, a female human being, and the special value of being a wife.
So if mother gets caught in that role as mother and doesn't develop other relationships and other roles in her life, then when it comes time for the kids to be launched from home,
it's more difficult.
It's more difficult.
It's more difficult.
So it's possible that the kids will stay so that mom will have meaning and definition to her life.
Yes. And mother won't do that intentionally and knowingly. Few women want to cripple their children. None. But that does happen. And it happens to good people that don't understand what's happening.
So if mom is really that dependent on that one role in her life, her marital relationship hasn't been nurtured and developed.
Absolutely. So one of the first things I can do to help an adolescent is to get that child's mother and father to like one another. I've never had to testify in a custody case where the child's parents took care of one another.
So how do you get mothers and fathers to like each other as husband and wife?
Gradually, cautiously, skillfully. And first of all, understandingly, that first of all, you've got to really believe that somehow or other that's a valuable relationship. Now, I've seen marriages fail, and I've seen marriages die because of divorce or death. And I've seen a family raised by one parent and that one parent do a marvelous job. But somehow or other, that parent has to be able to find something in his life or her life that helps them feel good about themselves, so that they aren't totally dependent on that child's presence in order to continue feeling good about themselves. That single mother, single father, or married couple, I want those folks to find some meaning in their lives.
So if mom is that attached to the daughter, she's in the middle of a process addiction. She doesn't really have contact with who she is, and so the objective might be to get her to look inward at herself and begin to discover the unique human that she is and love her.
And to value herself, to put some value on herself. That you know, the Shakespeare says, "'Tis one thing worse than self-love to self-hate." So I think we need to not be narcissistic about ourselves, but I think we need to have some value for ourselves, some respect of ourselves.
So what I've come to know in my own experience in life is that I have learned to like myself based on the feedback I've gotten from others about who I am.
Yes.
So their reaction to my personality is important in me knowing who I am.
Yes.
That makes us a social being.
That's right.
And I understand that back in 1967, when you put families together in multiple family therapy group, that one of the significant impacts that this particular approach to helping families is that social approach. Is that what you found?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I sort of fell into family therapy. I didn't know anything about family therapy. Nobody else did. Only one or two other people in the entire world were doing anything like that. Peter LeCoeur up in, I think, Connecticut or Vermont, was bringing in families of adult schizophrenic patients. I didn't know he was doing that. But when I organized the adolescent inpatient service, I had 10 beds and 10 children. And we notified those children's parents that we were going to have an all-adolescent service. And they came to learn some things about what that service would be like. I got all together in a room a little bit larger than this, and on a Friday afternoon, at 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, and I spent an hour telling them what they could expect. They sat around in chairs, and I sort of explained things to them. And the hour was up, and they were ready to go take their children out for some leave time, and I hadn't completed all I wanted to tell them, so I said, we'll meet again next Friday, and I'll finish up. So the next Friday, we met again, and I was holding forth with some ideas about what we were doing and what the adolescent service was going to be like. And I made a statement. Oh, the parents were sitting around, the children were sitting there. And I made a statement, and I said, you know, all parents love their children. One of the fathers snatched off his glasses and said, well, let me tell you something. If I've got to come here every week and listen to garbage like that, count me out. I don't want any part of this silly thing. And got up, walked up, slammed the door behind him. Well, there was a silence. Some nervous clearing of throats. I was hard to believe, a loss for words. But I managed to finish it up and said, we'll to the group, I said, we'll meet one more time. Next Friday will be the last. So the next Friday we gathered together again. Lo and behold, here was the father of that boy that I was, the one that had stormed out, the man who had stormed out. And I began to sort of give my little explanation to the families about what we were going to be doing. And he said, wait a minute, before you get started, he said, I've got to apologize. And he said, I'm sorry that I said what I said, and I'm embarrassed the way I behaved, and I want you, and I want to apologize to all of you here, and I hope you'll sort of forgive me for that. And I started to say something, and he said, you know, he said, when I was a little boy, my father abandoned me and my mother when I was 7 years of age. When my mother and I lived together for a year and she died, I was taken by members of her family and his family, and I spent the rest of my childhood going from pillar to post. And he said it was terrible. It was awful. And he said, he began to weep. Began to shed tears about it. One of the mothers in the group said, well, now wait a minute, hold on, Mr. Smith, let me tell you, you know, you sound a good bit like my childhood, except that I was a little bit older when it happened to me, and I had the same kind of experiences until my maternal aunt offered to take me, and oh, she talked to him, and he listened to her. Another parent chimed in and offered some advice. And I was standing there listening to what was happening and watching the interaction between this distressed man and these comforting people. It suddenly struck me, my Lord, what a powerful, powerful instrument this is. We've got something here valuable. We finished up that session in May of 1989, after 28 years of doing that. I was still holding that Friday afternoon session, treating families. Because what we had done, we had created a family of families. And you see, a family really is a psychological support system designed to sustain its members during periods of adversity. Think about that. A psychological support system designed to sustain its members during periods of adversity. Home is where the wound is healed, the balm applied. And here I had a system of systems, a group of families, and they were applying the balm, that they were helping to heal all these wounds. Someone has said that marriage itself is an attempt at healing. That we get married for various reasons, and a lot of times we get married to make life better. And that now I'm going to get married, everything will be all right. But here was these families come together. And I quickly saw that this was something that was very powerful. I could get Mr. Jones to talk to Billy Brown, and the kids would, families would sit in chairs, and the room wasn't big enough. I never wanted a room that's big enough. Don't ever do multifamily room in a room that's big enough.
How come?
Don't ever have a party in a room that's too big. Make people sit close to one another. Make them touch one another. Bring them together. Don't scatter them out. You don't want to have to. Do what you can to enhance the intimacy of that experience. And so I never would have enough room or enough chairs. And the kids would come in and flop on the floor, and the parents would sit in the chairs, and I would conduct group therapy for 50 people. 10 kids, 10 moms, 10 dads, 10 brothers, 10 sisters, an occasional uncle, an odd aunt, a grandmother, and grandfather. We would do multifamily group for an hour, once a week. And I could get Mr. Jones to talk to Billy Brown. And Billy Brown could not say, "There goes my old man again, treating me like a little boy." You short-circuit the dependency issue. Mr. Jones can say things to Billy Brown that Mr. Brown has already said. And they went in one ear and out the other.
Right.
Or that his son had to oppose to prove that he wasn't Daddy's little boy anymore. And I've had men in my group, fathers in my group, listen to a new arrival. Well, yes, we're here and we're unhappy, or our daughter has been doing this and doing that and doing the other, and my wife and I are just worried to death. We want to do something to get her straightened out, and so on and so on. And I'd have an old veteran of the multifamily group sitting in there, and he'd start shaking his head, and he'd say, "You know, Mr. Smith, you sound a whole lot like me." "What?" "Yeah, you sure do. I brought my daughter in here 6 months ago. I haven't come to this thing ever since then. And I said the same things that you were saying. I was just here to see about helping my daughter." And he said, "You're going to find out that you're going to help more than your daughter. And you're going to find out that you can benefit from what's happening here. And let me tell you what's happened in my family with me and my wife." And then he would talk and help this newcomer understand that we all are struggling.
So he could see where he came from, and the newcomer had a place to go.
That's right. That's right. And we always, when we had a family that would leave at the end of the treatment and go home, take their child and go home, we made them come back for 6 more sessions, because it's different back there than it is in this sheltered harbor. And we want people here to see that you do get well and someday you do leave, and sort of they could come back and offer some encouragement.
So that was a continuing care part of your...
That's right. And not only that, as they were struggling to make their adjustment back in the real world, they could file in their mind, well, I want to talk about this when we go to multifamily group next week, by golly. She did this and he did that, and I'm going to see what the rest of the group... And they would. They'd come and they'd bring up circumstances that had arisen in their home, and we'd talk about that. So in the multifamily group, a couple of things that are important to sort of remember. And one of my favorite rules is nobody has to talk. You don't have to talk. You have to come. You don't have to talk. It's hard to talk. People freeze up.
Right.
And a lot of times if you don't have to, it's a lot easier. So sometimes one group member would say, what's the matter with you? You never say anything. You ought to be contributing something. Because sometimes that particular person will be helpful 3 months from now by saying just one or two words. So that in a multifamily group, I tried to avoid the suggestion that you've got to contribute a certain number of words each time. Secondly, you have to kind of use yourself as a therapist and lend some of your strength to this one, then to that one, then to the other one, then to that one. When I began my training, my supervisor helping me to learn about psychiatry, and it was in the late 50s. We weren't doing couples therapy, family therapy, marital, any of that back then. But I had a patient who was depressed. And we were in the hospital, we were treating her, and she had talked to me about the problem she was having with her husband. So I told my supervisor, I said, I'm going to call the husband, I'm going to get him in, and the three of us are going to sit down and talk. He said, whoop, don't do that. And I said, what do you mean? He said, if you try to do therapy with your patient and you bring in her husband, you're not going to do any therapy. You're not going to be a therapist. You're going to end up as a referee. And that made a little bit of sense. I understood that, but I said, but I'm going to do it anyhow. And I went ahead and did it. And he was right. They were really going at one another. And I thought about, here I am refereeing. But it struck me that referees are good. And the one thing a referee must do is make sure he isn't on one side all the time.
Right.
He needs to blow the whistle when the blue team gets off. He needs to blow the whistle when the red team is off base. So as a therapist, I began to develop that skill to be able to have this person angry and upset, and to keep this person from terrorizing this one, but to help this one understand some of the things, so that at that particular time we weren't doing anything like multifamily group.
Right.
So as a therapist, and I did that for 30 years, running a multifamily group, one needs to use one's position as that powerful figure to bring some protection and to strike a posture of understanding. One of the parents, listening to things we were talking about in the early days, was sitting there wearing sunshades in the group, and he pulled them off and looked at me and said, you know, that's it. You're always on the side of these kids. You never think about us. You never think about giving me a hard time about it. That didn't sound like good news to me. It didn't make me feel real good, but I stopped and thought, this man needs to be able to say some things. I then realized he wasn't going to jump up and come hit me. So I helped him. And I said to him, you know, I think maybe you're right. We probably make some of the same mistakes y'all make. You know, they're important to us. And sometimes we get so caught up in their problem that maybe we overlook the problems that you folks have. Well, immediately somebody in the group came to my rescue. I said, wait a minute there. He said, you know, you're wrong. I've been in this group for such and such doctor. And I love to have some sort of controversy happen. I would never try to stamp it out. I would sort of, you know, give it some air, let it grow. Because almost invariably, you're going to find somebody else that's going to jump in and help take part in that.
When you're starting a group, do you have a way of joining with the group, of having everybody introduce themselves? Are there some stages to a group session?
Well, what we would do with each new, and it was an open group. I didn't make people wait to qualify for it. If you had a child under my care, you come into that. And that parent, we would introduce the parent. We'd get the parent to sort of say who he is. And then each person in the group would say, well, I'm Harry Jones, and this little redhead boy's daddy, something like that. And this Mama would say, and I'm his wife, I'm Helen, and I'm this, that, and the other. And we've been here now for about 3 months, and we've been pleased with what's happened, but they would go around and sort of do some kind of welcome wagon, is what I called it. I'd send out the welcome wagon, and they would sort of, this new neighbor just moved into the neighborhood, you see, and they would kind of tell them where things are, where the grocery stores and the dry cleaner and all that is. That is, they would tell them what this neighborhood is like. Right. And then the new family would say, well, I'm so and she's so, and we hear our daughter so, and we've been having these kind of problems, and they would talk.
So you'd move from the welcome wagon to problem definition.
That's right. That's right.
And from problem definition maybe into everybody interacting with everybody else.
That's right. That's
and
right.
the leader yourself becomes less central.
That's right. And it's delightful to have a nice one or two folks that I had one man whose daughter came to my unit, and she was there for maybe 6 months. He was there for every session, and he was there for 5 years. After she left, he kept coming. He was able to get something out of it every time he came. So yeah, I would have them define what they were up against, and would offer to the new families some word of encouragement, but I would then say, well, y'all all make it sound so nice and so easy, and it isn't nice and easy. Tell them about what happened on so-and-so, and well, yeah, then they would lay out one or two of the problems they'd had maybe in the group or in the hospital.
So the Corps had a definition for what you're talking about. He called that type of leader an orchestra conductor. And so
Absolutely.
You would focus on the process and direct, and they would put the content in.
Absolutely. I orchestrated. And I'd bring in the woodwinds, and sometimes I'd bring in the brasses, and I knew what my musicians were capable of doing, and I knew where I could go. I had one member I could just look over there, and I wouldn't have to say anything. He'd say, yeah, well, let me tell you. And he'd start. Right. And I learned some wonderful things from those people.
So, if I understand correctly, then your assessing these families actually took place in the multiple family.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I could tell, I can bring a child into my office, interview that child for 30 minutes, interview the family for 30 minutes. At the end of the hour, I know exactly what's wrong. And my early mistakes were that I made the mistake of believing that because it was apparent to me, that it must be apparent to them too. And it's not. It's not. I could assess them in that first hour, and I could pretty well conclude what was wrong, at what needed to be done. And the problem was it took months to get done. I needed a plan, and I had to devise that. What this family's needs were, and how to go about helping them learn those things. So that although I could quickly see what was wrong, I could not quickly get them to change their fundamental approach to one another. That was a slower process. But the multifamily group is really sort of like a neighborhood. And you've got people in that multifamily group that visit over the back fence and lollygag with the neighbor next door. And they talk free and easy with one another. Almost in every little neighborhood you got one family that sort of withdraws and sort of stays to themselves. And I think it's helpful to liken that multifamily group to a small neighborhood, and to understand that these folks feel isolated here because they feel isolated out there too.
Good point.
And out there isn't going to do anything about it. In here we should. And first of all, we must be sympathetic as to why they feel that way. And to recognize that they do. Whether they should or should not is beside the point. They do. And you need to have some kind of a plan in mind to help incorporate and bring those folks in to the bosom of that multifamily group.
So the dysfunction that's taking place in the family can be defined as social dis-ease, and multiple family group helps bring them back into social.
That's right.
Acceptable.
That's right.
Yeah.
You know, they under Mao Zedong, the Chinese used to have block meetings. Everybody that lived in that particular block or in that neighborhood would get together periodically, and they would solve neighborhood problems. There are a lot of politics involved in all of that, but it was sort of neighborhood therapy in a sense, you know. But we don't have that sort of prospect of treating a neighborhood. But you can bring together a group of people. And let me tell you, I had a diverse group. I had a commanding general in my group. I had people who were on welfare.
So let me ask you a question. How did you get the general to leave his general outside the door and bring dad and husband in? How did you do that?
Yeah, that was the trick. That's where the art comes in. I remember so clearly his daughter snuck off the unit, left. It was an open unit, and she slipped up and rang a friend. The friend rang the general. Well, sir, the general was down there with his adjutant in less than an hour, and he confronted me in my office and. What in the world are you going to do? And he and I were, on good terms, and I said, well, what have you done? Well, I've organized a search, and I've got the police, I've got this, I got that, and what are you going to do? And I said, I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to try to do whatever it is that you don't do. I'm going to try not to do the things that you do. Your daughter's in my care right now, partly because of the relationship that exists between you and her. And she, and her view of you as a general, I want her to get to know you as daddy. So, Harry, I'm not going to do what you want me to do. I'm going to do what I think is best for your daughter. And it's your privilege to leave her under my care or to remove her. Well, he left him because he was a good father. Underneath all those stars, he was a good father. And it took him some time, but we were able to help her get in touch with that part of him.
The same situation exists with physicians. They want to come into multiple family therapy groups, for example,
and bring the stethoscope with them.
Right.
Bring the stethoscope with them.
Any suggestions?
Huh?
Any suggestions on?
Sympathy. Sympathy, because I had them in my group, you know. I had them in my group. And again, they were folks who wanted to be helpful. And they wanted me to, you know, to talk with them a little bit about what the blood count was and what the electrolyte balances were and what category of medications. And, you know, they wanted to be a colleague.
Sure.
Wanted to be a colleague. And most of all, you know, they wanted, I think they wanted us to get along, and they wanted to not feel incompetent.
Right.
And to not feel inadequate. For some it was embarrassing that they were like everybody else. And you have to sort of be patient with them and understanding. But I think you have to also, you know, without being truculent, you have to sort of do what you think is right. And you have to recognize that, you know, that child really is my patient, but she's not my child. And they have the right to withdraw her from my care, and to do that without my being offended by it. It was my job, I thought, to let them know of the risks involved in leaving the treatment setting, and to say to them, I think that's a mistake. I think you're making a mistake to do that. But I wouldn't get angry with them. I wouldn't make them sign a release. I wouldn't try to protect myself legally, because that means I want to change the medical relationship to a legal one, because I think you're probably going to sue me, and I want to have a kind of piece of paper I can go into court, and you can't. It's what can be called defensive medicine, and when you start practicing defensive anything, this is what it looks like.
Right.
To me, that looks like defense. It doesn't look that way to you.
Yeah.
So that, you know, what we've got to do is to say, I think that'd be a mistake to do that. However, it's your child, and at your insistence, I'll discharge you. And I'd always write in the chart what I told him. And I'd always have a witness standing there listening to what I told him. And after they removed it, I would write up in the chart that I had told them that I thought that was wrong. I told them why I thought it was wrong. I told them what I thought might happen. And I'd sign that with the date, the time, and my name, and my head nurse would come and co-sign it with me. Now, my friend, that'll stand up in court. A piece of paper that says I'm not responsible. That's duress. Moreover, it's an angry patient. They're mad at you. And I would say to them, I'm your advisor. My advice is don't do that, but that's your child. Take her home. And I tell you what, I hope things turn out the way you think they're going to turn out and not the way I do. But in the event that things don't go well, call me. Give me a call and let me see what I can do to help. Now that's altogether different.
Right.
Altogether different from sign this paper, march out of here.
Yeah.
So that for those participants in the multifamily group, you do everything you can to keep them participating in the treatment milieu, while recognizing, you know, those are free and independent people. You can't make them.
So what do you think are the mechanisms of change? What do you think brings about change in people in multiple family therapy?
First of all, I think it's there are certain things that in order to bring about change, and these fundamental rules apply to individuals, they apply to organizations. First of all, to bring about change, the individual must first of all believe that change is needed. Okay? Secondly, that individual must participate in the process of change. Thirdly, he must know that he can halt the process whenever he sees fit to do so. None of us will embark on a process of change me into whatever you think I ought to be, change me in any way you want, and keep on doing it until you are satisfied. I might change, but first of all, I want to take part in the decision that change is needed.
So if I wait for you to determine what I need, I'm going to get less than what I need.
Well, that's right. And what I want to do as the agent of change, I want to have you tell me about how your life is going. And to tell me the good parts and the bad parts, the things that are creating problems for you. I always knew how to get kids to come into the hospital, how to get them to ask for help. It's a sneaky little trick. I would get them to talk about their life and how it was going. They wouldn't be seeing me if their life was going great.
Right.
So I let them talk for about an hour, telling me about how terrible things are. And I'd put this question to them. I would say to them, are you satisfied with the way your life is going? Most of the time, just a shake of the head. Next question, want to do something about that? That's what I call asking for help.
Right.
Nobody's going to come in and say, I'm having all these big problems, I want you to help me. We should let them talk about how painful life is. And then all you do is, find out, are you satisfied with that? You want things to keep on going? You want to do something up? Would you like to try to do something about that?
So people change when they arrive and accept where they are and make a decision they don't want to be there.
That's right. They begin to try to change. And even though you've decided you're going to try, it's still hard. And you might need some skilled help in being able to make that change. But if you're going to change an individual or change an organization, that individual has got to participate in the discussions that change is needed. Secondly, they got to participate in the decision and in the process of carrying out that change. Third, they got to know that they've got the right to veto it and to stop it before it gets out of hand. So, as a participant in a multifamily group, we want people to come here and talk and share their pain with us and share their joy and their things that they've learned with us. And if in that process you begin to conclude that there's some things about your life that you don't like and that you would like to try to make some changes in your life, we'll be glad to help with that, and we'll be glad to give you an agreement that you can quit anytime you want to.
So you're talking about helping people set themselves free.
Yes.
You're talking about freedom.
Yes, I used to make my adolescent patients decide when they were going to go home. And sometimes they would decide too soon. And I'd argue with them. I'd say, leave? You can stop treatment? Wait a minute, you're the one that said when you first came in that you want to do something about the way you were getting along with your mom. And that you want to do something about the way you've been getting along with girls in general. Now you want to tell me that the fight you had with Mary Ellen last weekend, you call that getting along? And you mean you want to keep on doing that? You want to stop trying to... And I was always able to persuade them.
So all of these points that you just talked about can be talked about in a multiple family therapy group session.
Oh, yes.
And in fact, when one family deals with it, every family is affected.
I didn't have to be the one. Ms. Brown would say, what are you talking about? You sat here last week and told us all. Your mother sat right there and wept the whole time, and you talking now about doing such and such and so on. So I think you're making some progress, Billy, but you know, crazy to talk about leaving now. You look like you really start.
So in an open-ended multiple family therapy group, you've got people coming in and leaving,
yes,
and at people at varying points, so that there's a legacy left with the group.
That's right.
And people learn what new people need to know, and the older ones help them learn.
That's right. And there's a body of knowledge that is sort of accumulated over a period of time.
Are you in control of that body of knowledge? Body of knowledge?
No, observant of it. Observant of it. And know how to orchestrate. And my job was not so much to do it myself, right, but to know how to get somebody else to do it.
So once you've got an ongoing group, it becomes really easy for the therapist.
Absolutely.
What if you are just beginning a group? What are your suggestions on?
Well, one of the wonderful things about starting a group is to talk about how scary it is. And to talk about, really, is it really safe to come in here and let your hair down? You got a bunch of strangers around here. And, you know, you think it's wise for us to come in here and share our problems like this? What's going to happen if somebody in here wants to tell somebody else? You talk about it. You talk about it. And you get people to talk about how hard it is to trust. And you don't demand instantaneous trust. I would tell my families, you have no reason whatsoever to trust me. You don't know me. You've never seen me. So you have no reason to trust me. On the other hand, you really have no good reason to mistrust me. I've never done anything to harm you. I'll tell you what, I'm willing to meet you right there with your not trusting me and your not mistrusting me, and I'm prepared to earn your trust. And if I don't earn it, don't give it to me.
You made the statement in a workshop that I attended with you once that an adolescent can have a significant life experience and bring about change if they have one good relationship.
Yes, yes. Sometimes they could work through a horrible relationship with their father through me. And some of them would come and fight with me, not this way, but verbally. And I had to know, I had to have a plan of things to do, and I had to provide corrective living experiences. And I had a boy who was brought into the hospital that was an abused child. He was 14 years of age, right husky fella. He was abused, and he was abusive. And he was failing in school and getting into fights and attempted suicide and all sorts of horrible things. The mother and father were constant at one another's throats. This boy had a terrible view of the world and of himself. And I went to make rounds, and my nurse was standing there on the phone, and I spoke to her, and she spoke to me, and indicated she'd be right with me. While waiting for her to finish the phone call, this boy came walking up, said, "Hello, Dr. Orvin." And I said, "Oh, hello, Jimmy. How are you?" "Oh, I'm fine." So he stood there with me. The nurse finished her call, hung up the phone, turned to me, and as she started to say something to me, he interrupted. And she said, "Now, wait a minute, Jimmy. Dr. Orvin was here first. You'll have to wait until I talk with him." "Oh, you GD broads are all alike. You never..." And I spun around, I stamped my foot, and I said, "How dare you? Don't you dare talk to her like that, young man. Don't you talk to her like that. I won't stand for that." He said yes and slinked away. That was a corrective living experience. It was the first time in his life that an adult male didn't box him in his mouth for what he'd just done. It was the first male in his life that was protecting a woman. His father was accustomed to pummeling his mother, beating his mother as well as beating him. I saw him an hour later. "Hello, Jimmy." "Well, Dr. Orvin." I was prepared to challenge the belief in his mind that this is the way men treat women, and this is the way men treat children. I knew that he needed that. So that comes from an understanding of what that problem is. And I was able to redefine for him what fathers are like, and to suggest to him that, wait a minute, not all fathers will treat you that way.
Is it possible that situations like that could take place in a multiple family therapy group?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Corrected living experiences.
Yes, sirree. And in the multifamily group, you know, there's going to be anger. There's going to be sadness, tears, a lot of laughter, a lot of fun. And you can learn a lot. You know, you want to kind of watch and see who sits by the door, so they can be the first one out. You want to also watch and see who sits by whom. You want to watch and see who won't sit by whom. I had a woman and her daughter sitting in the multifamily group waiting for Papa to come in. There was a seat on each side of them and a seat in between them. He came in and quickly saw the two of them sitting there, went and sat by his daughter, put his arm around the back of the daughter's chair, and turned his backside to his wife. Now that said something to me. It said something. I saw the woman's response to that.
That'd be one way to start an interaction between the two of them.
Ah, boy.
Asking her what it was, what he meant, and then getting her to ask him.
Oh, I went into it. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Grist for my mill. And before we started even, I said, "What'd that feel like?" "What do you mean? What do you mean?" So I saw him. I saw him, and you did too. Came in and looked. Decided to go sit by Ellen. She blushed and said, "Well," then it all, you know, she's able to talk about that. He's then able to sort of give some kind of explanation about it. And the group is then able to talk about, well, you know, we need to have some things going between ourselves as parents. Children have a way of coming in between. So, you know, almost invariably, they're going to provide you with a rich clinical material.
You've trained a lot of people to run multiple family therapy groups. What were some of the things that you wanted these people to know?
The trainees.
In addition, the therapist, the multiple family group leader, in addition to what you've already talked about, were there any other things that you wanted the therapist to know before they started leading multiple family therapy groups on their own, for example?
Yeah, well, I wanted them to have some understanding of family systems. Right. I wanted them to have that. And I guess one of the main things I wanted them to understand was that it wasn't their group.
What do you mean?
I referred to it as my multifamily group. It's not mine, it's theirs. It's their group.
Right.
And that when I would go into a multifamily group thinking, now what do I need to talk about today? I would carry with me some sort of a burden that sort of said it's up to me. So I would go into multifamily group, and I would sit. I'd go in before the group got there. I'd go in and I'd arrange the chairs. I did my adolescent groups that way.
Why did you arrange the chairs?
I wanted to impose a degree of order on the group. I wanted the time to be effective. I was not there to play. I wanted it always in the same room. I wanted those children to know that it was always at the same time. And I wanted them to know that Dr. Orvin had taken time to come and get the place arranged for them. It said, I'm thinking about you, I'm planning your recovery. And it imposed a degree of control on the group that might be seen as anti-therapeutic. One cannot have a sort of rigid group. One needs to have some relaxation and some flexibility. One also ought not have chaos.
Well, of course, there was the school teacher type of leader, there was the director type of leader, yes. There was a laissez-faire type of leader,
that's right.
And the orchestra conductor.
That's right. That's right. And sometimes you need to do a little bit of each one, and I disabused myself of the belief that there is such a thing as co-therapists. You can have two people doing therapy, but then you've got to be co. One's going to have a little bit more experience than the other, one's going to defer to the other, one's going to have a little bit more authority than the other.
So you don't want to put two director types together.
No, that's right, and you need to recognize that it's okay. Right. I had a lovely lady who worked with me, a social worker, Libby Riddle, and she helped me with that group. She and I would work it together, and we understood one another and understood the treatment plan. And so we'd collude about what we wanted, but I had a way of sort of doing treatment that was effective, but it was one of several different kinds of treatment.
Right, right.
And I wouldn't for a moment suggest that mine was the way to do it, but one of the ways, and there are others who are, I think, less formal in their approach to it. I thought that whatever I did, I needed to be as much like me as I could be. You see, as I sit here today, I'm wearing a three-piece suit, gold watch chain, cufflink. That's me. Now, if I were to get down on the floor with adolescents, somehow believing that I was going to have rapport with them, that I was going to be one of the fellas, they'd spot me for a phony. Right. And that's what I'd be. So I caught myself and wouldn't let myself do things like that.
So you gave yourself permission to be you.
That's right. And for better or worse, that's
the way it is.
That's what they got. They got me. And it could be better in some ways, but it could be worse in some ways too.
I've heard some mental health professionals say that the key to helping people is to make sure that you're the best human being that you can be.
That's right. And somehow rather come to terms with yourself. That's what I think is the real big mission in life. Is to sort of find out who we are and to come to terms with that. And in my book I quote Bobby Burns.
What's the name of your book?
Understanding the Adolescent. Going to be published by the American Psychiatric Association Press. But I quoted some of Bobby Burns's poetry. And one of them has to do with his Ode to a Louse. And he's sitting in church, Bobby Burns is. And in comes this lovely, lovely, beautiful young woman in satin and lace. And he's a young man noticing pretty young women. And fate would have it, she comes and sits in the pew right in front of him. and the fragrance of her, and he sits there and he's impressed with them. And then he's talking about the beauty of her, and then he said, oh, suddenly from beneath her bonnet crept a wee louse. She was lousy. She looked pretty, smelled pretty. She wasn't. And he said, oh, would some power, the gift to give us, to see ourselves as others see us. 'Twould from many a blunder free us, and even devotion. We can't see the back of our head. And there are parts of ourselves that we don't see. Part of the struggle is to try to come to know oneself, the good parts and the bad parts. And at some point in life, as in the 40s and 50s, we begin to review what's happened. As I look back on my life at that period, as I began to do that, I could find events and aspects, parts that I did not celebrate, things that I wish I'd done differently. But somehow or other, I had to recognize that this is me, and I am the product of many, many, many things. This is what's left of George Orvin. And to recognize that, yeah, I wish I hadn't done that, but I did. And to embrace that as being part of me, because trying to deny it means being sick. Embracing it and making it part of me, and getting on with my life. Circumspect in what I do today, because that which I do today, tomorrow I must embrace. So we at that part of our life where we begin to come to terms with who we are and what we're becoming. And it's at a time when a lot of people have adolescent children that we begin to do some of that. And you haven't always got your mind on the adolescent child's needs. Sometimes you're struggling in yourself, elaborating who I am and celebrating parts and maybe feeling bad about parts, but getting on with the process of becoming.
And so in multiple family group therapy, the person can begin to get glimpses of themselves.
That's right.
And the therapist who can share his or herself with that group is in actuality sharing a process that they can emulate.
Absolutely. And while I'm doing that and reviewing myself, I must stop and recognize the context in which those things took place. Again, Burns' poetry. And another one, he's an ode to a mouse. And he's a farmer, he's out plowing, and inadvertently he turns over a nest, a field mouse. And he stops and he's speaking to the mouse and he's apologizing for tearing up his home. And he points out to the mouse that that things sometimes, and for both mice and man, things Afghan ugly. Things don't always turn out the way we want them to, and that we need to recognize that and to come to terms with the fact that the best laid plans of both mice and man often go astray. And that's because we're human, but being human, we have the advantage over the mouse. We can sort of reflect on our past, visualize our future, and prepare ourselves for our future by coming to terms with our past and having an understanding of who we are and what we are.
And the mouse has to take some responsibility for having a destroyed house too.
That's right.
Yeah.
And Burns lets him know that.
The closing of a group, closing of a multiple family therapy group, you've got a mom crying, it's an hour has gone by, what do you do?
Well, I think it's right tacky to get up and leave a wound unsewed. The surgeons always sort of open you up and then they always sew you back together. So I think it's awfully important to try to do something around helping that individual at that particular juncture. And sometimes it's not necessary that the whole group stay on. Almost invariably there's somebody there, me or my co-therapist. And that might be a good time to sort of do some individual sort of stuff anyhow.
Would that, for example, if this person had consistently waited until 15 minutes before the group started to do any work, would that be reinforcing them waiting to do their group work late?
Yeah, and what you want to do is, without having them feel rotten about it, you want to try to understand and talk with them a little bit about how scary this must be. I noticed you waited until almost the end. Maybe you were afraid that once it got started you couldn't handle it. Maybe you were afraid that people would jump on your body. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Or put a Band-Aid on it and say, come back next week and start off at the beginning.
That's right.